Thanks for joining us for this episode of Got Your Six, Lads Advice Encounters with me, Gav Topley and Friends. This episode is a special in which we introduce an inspirational woman of the month. As Lads Advice is an all-male group, this provides an opportunity to celebrate the outstanding achievements made by women in our society and to gain a different perspective on the topics discussed in the group. This month's episode is particularly special as it falls on the week of International Women's Day, a global day celebrating the economic, cultural and political achievements of women. Our guest is Bridget Kendall. Bridget worked for the BBC for over 30 years, where she was their Moscow and diplomatic correspondent. In that role, she's interviewed an array of world leaders, including George H. Bush, Hillary Clinton, and Viktor Yushchenko, the then president of Ukraine. Bridget is a Russian speaker who has twice interviewed Vladimir Putin, and she's frequently called upon by respected news outlets and academic discussion panels for insight, analysis, and commentary in relation to Russian affairs. She appeared on the BBC TV Question Time only last week on a panel discussion around the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Bridget's the first female Master of Peterhouse, the oldest of the 31 colleges that together form the University of Cambridge. She's awarded the MBE in the 1994 New Year's Honours List for services to journalism, and she's an honorary fellow of the British Academy. Bridget, I know you're extremely busy and in demand at the moment due to the unique insight that you can offer in relation to current affairs, and so we're extremely grateful for you taking the time to speak to us. Welcome to the podcast, and thanks for joining us.
Nice to talk to you.
Now, I guess it's International Women's Week, and that's pretty appropriate as a time to be speaking to you as something of a trailblazer. Your career, I've seen you sat on many sort of all-male panels. You're the first female master of the oldest college in the University of Cambridge. Could you tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to be where you are today?
Well, I should say I never in 1,000 million years thought I would ever be master of a Cambridge college. Actually, I was brought up in this city. My father was a professor here, and I went to an all-girls school, and I used to ride past on my bicycle this Master's Lodge where we're sitting now. And in those days, which is the 1970s, I never thought this college, Peterhouse, would ever have female students. And I never thought it would have a female master. And I never in a million years thought that master would be me. So it's quite a good lesson in how life can turn out in a way you really don't expect when you're young. You just could never imagine the world would change so much, but also that opportunities might come along which would affect you personally. But my route to it was actually through learning Russian. At my school, you could take up an extra language. I was studying French and Latin, and I like languages. And you could take up an extra one. And I was drawn to Russian partly because it's a bit exotic. It has a different alphabet. And also Russian literature is just amazing. Mm-hmm. We all know about Russian ballet and music, and the novels are wonderful in classic Russian literature. And also this was the Cold War, and it was the enemy, and I was intrigued to find out more about this other side, this slightly mysterious place it was very hard to get to. And it turned out to be a very good choice because I did the equivalent of GCSEs and A-levels, and then I went on to university to study it. And my father had said to me, pursue this, Bridget, because you'll always stand out in a crowd. And he was totally right. And it meant that when I wanted to apply to do certain things, well, in the first place, spend a year in Russia to improve my language. Obviously, if I hadn't been studying it, I wouldn't have got that scholarship. And that was a complete eye-opener in the middle of the 1970s, at the height of the Cold War, to find yourself 10 months in the Russian provinces. In fact, in Voronezh, not very far from where Ukraine is now, and it's still useful to this day for me to have an instinct of how ordinary people think and behave away from the politicians. But after that, I found if I wanted to try and do other things, I didn't have any money of my own, and I needed scholarships to get to places. The fact that I had studied Russian and kept it up and spent time there always made it seem like people were interested to interview me for positions because they just wanted to see what it would, why I knew about this slightly strange, exotic thing. Not that Russia's that strange and exotic, it's a huge country in the world, but there aren't so many experts in our country.
No.
So it was open doors for me, and one door it opened was a job at the BBC. They thought it'd be very useful to have someone who spoke Russian, and that in the end led to them asking me to go to Moscow in 1989 to be the correspondent there. And of course, I didn't realize the Soviet Union was going to collapse in 2 years' time. My feeling was that things weren't going terribly well for the reforms that were happening, and I thought there might be a grab back of power by the communists. In fact, they did try and grab back power in 1991, but it failed, and the whole thing fell apart. And then I stayed there to see the new post-Soviet Russia emerge and all the other republics before moving on to other BBC jobs. I was in Washington for 5 years in the 90s, and I came back to London at the end of the 90s to take up the senior post of diplomatic correspondent. And immediately my colleagues at the BBC said, Bridget, you know about Russia. Can you go back to Russia for us and do some reports? So I got stuck into Russia again, as well as covering, well, from then on, the end of the 90s, we had so many global conflicts, didn't we? Kosovo, 9/11, the invasion of Iraq, the Arab Spring, Afghanistan coming back again, and, you know, Georgia, in Putin's invasion of Georgia, then Crimea in 2014. So there's endless international crises. But it turned out to be quite a good time to get stuck back into Russia because people began to feel this was a country they needed to understand better. So I always sort of kept my interest up in that way. And it's been fascinating through the years, sometimes exhilarating and joyful, and sometimes, as now, very upsetting and grim.
Absolutely, and I think you're right. It's likely that a lot of our listeners have probably never visited Russia or certainly don't have an in-depth knowledge of the culture. Could you speak a little bit about the time that you spent there when you were there for 10 months and how that might contrast to being in the UK and sort of how you found being in Russia and what you observed about the culture?
Okay, so roll back to the mid-1970s. This is 1976 to 77. And in fact, what was happening internationally was that the communist Soviet government did a deal with the West called the Helsinki Agreement, which was to try and create more stability on both sides at a time when each side had nuclear weapons, about how Europe would be organized. And some critics said that it kind of cemented the Yalta Agreement, which split Europe down the middle and kind of signaled the West's acceptance that the Soviet Union should control not just the whole of 15 Soviet republics, but the Eastern Bloc, East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, and so on. But what it also did was to create some commitments the Soviet Union had to sign up to on things like human rights. So it also gave huge power to the tiny dissident movement in the Soviet Union. So it had its pluses and its minuses. But when I set off to Russia, we all thought we were in an era of détente because this agreement had just been signed. In fact, looking back on it, it wasn't. It was sort of the height of the Cold War. In fact, it was just 3 years before the Soviet Union got involved in an invasion of Afghanistan, 1979. And then Reagan came to power and relations went into a really deep freeze. But we were, at that time, they sent 12 of us who were undergraduates learning Russian. There was another group who were postgraduates who went off to Moscow and Leningrad, as St. Petersburg used to be called, to work in the archives. They were doing research, but we were basically just there to learn or improve the language. And so the Soviet authorities thought that to keep us away from these dissidents, they would send us to a provincial university where there weren't really any Westerners at all. Right. Yeah. And so Voronezh had, it's a big industrial town, it had about 1 million people, very Russian, very remote, in the sense it was in Western Russia, but it was pretty cut off from the outside world. And it had been very badly damaged by the Nazis during the war, then rebuilt. There were quite a lot of other foreigners, but they were all from developing countries there on Soviet aid. So I had some friends who were doctors from Ethiopia and from Mali, and engineers from Cuba and from Angola. There were people from Vietnam and Laos, so sort of friends of the Soviet Union. Yeah. So that in itself was interesting, to meet these different people who were quite pleased to have these Soviet scholarships, but I think some of them faced quite a lot of racism, so they had a slightly ambivalent attitude towards the life they were leading in the Soviet Union. But as far as Western students went, there were just the 12 of us from Britain, and I think a couple of Italians and a Belgian girl, and a lot of East Germans. We were known as the students from the Kapstrani, from the kapitalistické strany, the capitalist countries, as opposed to the East Germans and Vietnamese and Angolians, who are known as the students from the Socstrany, the socialistické strany, the socialist countries. And I shared a room with another English girl and 2 Russians, who of course were there to report on us, we knew that. So we were in one room, it was quite a spacious room, but it wasn't that big. It had 4 beds in it, 2 wardrobes, a fridge, a television and a table with 4 chairs, and we were all crammed together in this space. There were communal showers. They were turned on for a couple of hours every morning and every evening, and that was it. And then they rotated between men and women. So you could get a shower maybe a couple of times a week, and probably only half of them worked. I took to going to the local Russian bathhouse, banya, like steam baths, except it's not dry steam like a sauna, it's wet steam. And of course, you take all your clothes off when you go in to get to use the bath, and so there were just everyone else in there was Russian, and mostly old Russian ladies. And so they never knew I was a foreigner, so I quite liked that. So they'd say, "Devushka, girl, come over here and beat me with birch twigs." And so you could feel for just a little moment that you were being treated like everyone else and not seen as a foreigner. Because, of course, when they looked at us, the way we behaved or stood, of course, our Russian accent, but also particularly the clothes we wore, everyone in that city knew we were foreign. So you were sort of exhibit A. And they had no idea what life was like in the West. People would say to me, because everyone lived in very cramped conditions, often, 2 or 3 people in one room or a whole family in 2 rooms. So they'd say, "How many rooms do you have?" And when I was saying, my father has actually 6 children, we have quite a lot of rooms, they would think I must be a millionaire. And one old lady I remember asked me, "How many cows does your father have?" Because it's a very rural part of Russia, and in those days, mid-1970s, still very agricultural. They had no idea what was going on in the outside world. I remember having an argument with a friend who was convinced that in 1966 Russia had won the World Cup. And I said, no, that was the year England won. But they had very limited information, very filtered information. So everything at the Olympics, they always thought the Russians won everything. They had no idea that. I remember one young woman who I got quite friendly with, and she was just convinced that everything was the other way around from the way we saw it. Where we thought the Russians have invaded somewhere, they thought the Americans had. It was like sort of mirror image, really. And they had no idea of the censorship that they were under. You could go to the library and look up Dostoevsky, so famous Russian writer, Crime and Punishment, right? And you might find Crime and Punishment, but some of his later novels just weren't there.
Right.
So most Russians didn't even know they were missing them.
Sure.
And so it was real eye-opener, really, about what a society can be like when it's really cut off. I mean, one of the interesting things about now is I don't think a place like Voronezh could ever be cut off to that extent, because they've got social media.
Yeah.
So although if you watch television and decided to believe it, you could take a line from the Kremlin. Most people don't do that in their lives now. They've got an iPhone. Maybe certain accounts are banned now in Russia, but you find a workaround, or people tell you things, or they send you things. So I think it's quite interesting at the moment to see how this whole question of what Russians think and believe about Ukraine, but it'll be a big contrast to what I meant there. The other thing about Russia in the mid-1970s was that, unlike today, at least up until this month, it was a place of huge deficit, and everyone will have heard about the shortages. They really were. I mean, in a place like Voronezh, okay, a city with 1 million people, so it's like being sent to Birmingham. It's a big city. But they had quite normal things they didn't have. You couldn't get toilet paper. You couldn't get washing up liquid. I got a hole in my sweater and said to my Russian roommate, so I'm going down to the main shop in town to buy a needle and some wool to mend it. And they said, "Don't be silly, you can't buy those things." And I said, "Well, what do you do then?" She said, "Well, obviously you unravel an old sweater. That's the way you mend."
Right, okay.
So there were lots of people found workarounds, but the sort of affluent Western consumer society that we take for granted, where you have so many choices and it's just how far your money will go. It was the other way around in Soviet Russia. Everyone had the money that they had from their wages and they had nothing to spend it on. So everyone was always queuing and trying to get an advantage, and a lot of people were really very poor, and they hadn't much idea that in the outside world it was any different. I remember, I'm going on now, but you opened a can of worms here asking me to tell you what it was like in the mid-1970s. A couple of my Russian friends said, "Oh, we know someone who went to Poland." And guess what? Ice cream in Russia, you could get chocolate ice cream and you could get vanilla ice cream. Very nice, but that was it. And they said, "Do you know, in Poland, you can get strawberry ice cream as well." And I didn't have the heart to tell them that in Baskin and Robbins you could get 30 flavours. So it sounds funny, but actually it was just, these were people like you and me. They just happened to end up in this country, which was, the economy really didn't work. And one of the big things that changed when the Soviet Union collapsed and they got rid of price controls so people could sell things for what they really had value. Prices went up. To begin with, there was hyperinflation, but also people were incentivized to, instead of for hoarding, to sell things. And so the shops filled up too. And by the time Putin came along in the year 2000, the things were beginning to run much better, and you could go to an ordinary supermarket and buy stuff without having to queue. And you could get medicines, and you could buy whatever book you wanted. And he benefited from that, Mr. Putin, because he brought stability, he brought inflation down. So in the first 10 years of the 2000s, you had shops that were full, and people had slightly more money because inflation wasn't rampant. And they felt a whole lot better about their life. So they felt a lot better about their president too. And one of the things, of course, about these recent sanctions is suddenly they're going back to a world that they thought they'd put behind them. And the big question is, who will they blame? Will they blame their president, or will they blame the West?
And so that's really fascinating in terms of what we're hearing, across sort of social media and in the news, is this disconnect between the sort of the Russian leadership and elite, and then the Russian people, including, Russian troops who it's reported are not being given a full picture, or perhaps given a very skewed narrative.
That's beginning to filter out. And so Russians still have conscripts in their army. In recent years, it's been illegal to send a conscript into a conflict zone. But the workaround seems to be that they just say to these young lads, well, sign this form. And sometimes they will want to become, as they call it, a kontraktnik, because they might get better pay. And then they've signed up. And what we're hearing from little snippets is that quite a lot of these people, including possibly officers, thought they were being sent for training exercises to the border. And actually, to be honest, when we had all these satellite pictures of the Russians piling up on the border, I thought that's what was happening too, because since 2008, President Putin said, we're not battle ready enough. And they've been having constant readiness exercises. In fact, talking to NATO senior staff, they in recent years, they've said, we're quite worried that the Russians have been having so many exercises. They'd be much better to go into conflict from a standing start than we would, because we're just not training as much. Now, actually, in practice, it hasn't worked out quite like that. And one of the reasons is because it's one thing to be in many training exercises. It's another thing to suddenly be told, go that way today, and suddenly you find you're over the border and you're shooting at Ukrainians. And one of the reasons it seems that they didn't know is certainly for the conscripts. I don't know about the senior officers. It seems as though these days they take their mobile phones off them, which is perhaps not surprising. This has been a problem in place in theatres like Iraq and Afghanistan with ordinary soldiers, our own soldiers or NATO soldiers, revealing information on social media, which is really not a good thing to do. So, but if that's the case, that the Russians took their mobile phones off them, you can see why they would end up being a bit blind and deaf about what was going on around them, and why they should have been so shocked when suddenly they would come up against either furious Ukrainian villagers or, an awareness that they weren't shooting just at military targets, and of course resistance from Ukrainian both servicemen and also all these volunteers who are now out there. So that's on the military front. And I think an interesting thing has been, we have to be a bit careful when we see on social media these little videos. Probably you and people listening will have seen some of these Russian soldiers who've either been captured or given themselves up, or maybe somewhere in between. And you can imagine that they seem to be very hungry. There's pictures of them just wolfing down bread and tea. And there have been complaints, little snippets on Russian media saying they really haven't had enough food, which it's hard to believe they would have gone into this without the logistic backup worked out, but that seems to be one of the problems, and fuel as well. But so they're hungry, so they're given food by these Ukrainians, and then somebody says to them, usually a woman, would you like to phone your mum? Well, of course they say yes. Because she doesn't know where they are. She doesn't even realise they've been in danger. They know they've been in danger. Phone home. Hello, mum. Here I am. I'm all right. What? Where are you? I thought you were on exercise. No, I'm not. I'm in Ukraine and I'm in a war. And then the mother starts crying. But the next thing is, I can hear when I'm listening to it in Russian that she's then thinking, well, is this the whole thing a stitch up? Is this Ukrainian propaganda? Are they just pretending? What am I to believe? This isn't what I'm hearing on the television. She doesn't know what to think. But nonetheless, I think those phone calls home must be very powerful and must do something to create a sense among at least the families of these soldiers. Maybe it's not quite what we're being told on the telly. And we'll see where that goes.
And I think there is, a huge amount of what you might call information warfare around this particular topic at the moment. But not just that, it can be quite difficult to know, if you're not an expert as you are in this area, which threads to pick up and run with and which to believe and which are not. I know there's Colonel Richard Kemp is on Twitter giving one narrative that seems to be along the lines that, Russia may well prevail here, and then Dr. Mike Martin takes the opposite view. And so that's just more of an academic disagreement, but also knowing what's propaganda, what's not propaganda, and where to get your news. I think for a lot of the young men that I've spoken to on the group has been quite difficult and quite sort of anxiety-inducing. Do you have any...
Well, all I can say is in the world we live in, this sort of social media, plethora of media world we live in, it's more important than ever to, when you start to read something, to look at who's posting it and to try and get a sense of whether you trust that. And it, I know, I look and see, it's ex-journalist, I know them.
Sure.
I mean, there was a very good little... post I saw the other day from a journalist who I know. He's Russian and he happens to be in Ukraine, and I think he was in Odessa, and he retweeted this picture of a road sign, and it said I think it just said Odessa, excuse my language, fuck off.
Yes.
Moscow, whatever it said, something this way, and then just fuck off home. Sure. And then it was retweeted underneath, how do I know this isn't a fabrication? And then the journalist said, well, you're right to be skeptical, but I'd like to tell you I took that photo myself half an hour ago. Right, because I actually happen to know this journalist. I'm pretty sure it's true.
Sure.
But, you don't always, if you don't know that journalist, you just think, well, this is part of the fabrication.
Yeah.
So it is quite difficult to tell. I mean, some of the things that I see, if they're quite lengthy and they're in Russian, you can kind of get a sense of whether they're real or not. So there was one little stream I saw a couple of days ago of a governor in Siberia who's in, it looks like it's a gym because you can see the bars on the wall in a school or something. And he's talking to a group of women and they're saying, where are our sons? We don't know where they are. And he's saying, look, it's all right. It's a special operation. They said, that's not what we hear. We think they're in danger. They're just being used. And these are angry mothers talking to the governor. So it's quite blurry, and it looks to me like it was filmed on an iPhone by someone surreptitiously, who was probably one of the women, and then posted, and it's gone all over the place. It's relatively long, and listening to the Russian, I don't think that's fabricated. And anyway, it rings totally true to me. But it's only a tiny snippet. You have to realize that you're only getting one little microcosm, so who knows what's happening elsewhere. Similarly, inside Ukraine, you can be fairly sure when you see a tractor dragging a tank off that it must be a Ukrainian tractor, right? Because there aren't any Russian tractors there.
Sure.
But if you see another smouldering piece of hardware, you might, you just have to think twice about this being posted as a sign of, Russians in trouble. But actually, whose was it? So, that's an obvious thing that you have to be careful about. And when it comes to analysis, some people, of course, are just doing what I'm doing now and picking up snippets and trying to put it together. Yeah. And they will reach different conclusions because it's a half-filled jigsaw puzzle and you're filling in the other bits. Sure. So is it glass half empty or glass half full? And there, you just have to try and find people that you rely on. There's a good website and set of journalists connected to it called Bellingcat. Yes. Maybe you've talked about them before. Who've been massively successful in using open source material to really get under the skin of what the Russians are up to. They're the ones who told us a lot about the guys who went to poison Skripal and his daughter. And they've done a lot of work on the downing of the Malaysian airliner it was 2014, wasn't it, in Ukraine. So I think that's quite a good source. And I've also seen that they post and say, watch out, guys, this looks as though it might be true, but this is the kind of thing that's very easy to fabricate.
Sure.
So that's also helpful. And that gives you a sense if you're if you're looking down at on Twitter, the postings, and it's the kind of place that's saying that, you think, well, actually, that sounds like they make sense.
Yeah.
The Ukrainian side, obviously, they're part of the propaganda warfare, whether it's the Ukrainian government or military. They have had very inflated figures for Russian casualties, for example.
Sure.
NATO is much, much lower. So when you see two different sets of figures, you can think, well, okay, there's a discrepancy there. Of course, the Russians are much lower still.
Yeah.
But you have to, everyone has to become like a journalist and approach every piece of information and picture with some skepticism and interrogate it and look at its context as far as you can and see if it adds up with what you think makes sense and fits in with other bits of information you've got. And always interrogate yourself whether this is reinforcing what you want to hear or whether actually it's something which means you have to adjust your thoughts.
Sure.
Because we all fall into the trap of wanting to join up those dots in a way that makes either a comforting picture or seems to work rather quickly.
Yes.
And actually the way war works, as everybody knows, is that unexpected things happen. And you have to be constantly alert and aware when you're trying to pull together this information to not let your own prejudices get the better of you.
Absolutely. And I think, we spoke about the buildup of troops on the Russian border and the wide belief that there was not going to be an invasion. This was a training exercise or at the most
saber rattling.
Yeah. And then the invasion takes place.
Yeah.
You've eaten dinner, I believe, several times with Putin. You've interviewed him twice. Yeah. So have a bit of a unique insight into what his frame of mind and his thinking might be. What was driving that, do you think, this decision to actually invade?
A lot of Russian experts, not just me, many of them were just flabbergasted that he would do this. And the reason is that we could already foresee some of the problems they seem to have been encountering already and more to come. I mean, one was, this is a large territory. I mean, let's face it, Western armed forces have had recent experience of that in both Iraq and Afghanistan, both of which, because they're so big, you can go in quickly and make, have shock and awe and make an impact, but how do you then hold it or even reach it, all of it? And that's exactly what he was taking on in Ukraine. That's number one. Number two, I think the really stunning thing here for many people was that Ukraine and Russia, precisely as he said, that they're very close. In fact, he said Ukraine is so close it doesn't really exist, it's part of Russia. So if you're saying that, then how can you expect either side, your soldiers or the people who you are attacking, to think that you are sincere in your belief that they're one people? They're the last people in the world you want to attack, aren't they? Because they're so close to you.
Yeah.
Lots of people speak the same language. Many, many Ukrainians have relatives in Russia, and most Russians, certainly in Western Russia, will have some family member in Ukraine or friends, or they've been there a lot. So this is why it's so important for Mr. Putin and those working with him to try and drum home the message to the Russians that there isn't a war. Because it's very hard to sell a war with Ukraine.
Yes.
You could say, as they've tried to, that there's a band in charge who are illegal. They call them neo-Nazis and fascists, which is a bit hard to stomach on several fronts. Number one, their president is Jewish, so how does that one work? Number two, they've been there since 2014, and the Russians have even negotiated a treaty, an agreement with them, the Minsk agreement. So how come they were dealing with them and now they suddenly think they're so awful they have to use armed forces to get rid of them? Right. So there are lots of inconsistencies there. But if it's not just a war against the top band, who you are liberating the Ukrainian people from, but you are actually shelling apartment blocks and hospitals and schools and whole towns and villages. How do you sell that to the Russian people? So none of us could see how he could do that just because he'd lost patience with NATO. It didn't seem like that was a reason. So the only other way he can justify it is to say, well, actually, this is a war with NATO. And that, I think, explains why NATO's been so hands-off. And everyone in the West is so frustrated to say, we can't leave the Ukrainians there as sitting ducks. You've got to help them. But the moment you introduce NATO into the conflict, you create a narrative that Putin can sell to his people and say, we're now at war with NATO, you need to defend the motherland. But in the first 2 weeks so far, he's not been able to do that because it was very clear he moved, we can see where the chess pieces went. They went across the border that way.
Right.
No one came across into the Russian side. So it didn't really add up. And so everyone has really been puzzling. So what led to this? And certainly there was a building over many years of growing resentment and suspicion of the West. And he has signaled that to the West very clearly from 2007 onwards. He gave a speech to the Munich Security Conference when he said, I'm warning you in the West, if NATO is enlarged. He didn't, before that, so much protest at NATO enlargement. He even dallied with the idea of Russia joining NATO, but something snapped, and it may have been, I think it was a variety of factors of, I could enumerate them, but that gets kind of quite detailed. But anyway, in 2007, he sort of came to the conclusion. I think an important thing was George W. Bush was quite keen to encourage Ukraine and Georgia to think of NATO membership. And he was just saying enough is enough. Now, after that, NATO has been quite careful not to say, they're certainly not invite them in. It hasn't closed the door on them on the grounds that they're sovereign nations and they should have the right to choose. That has not been enough for Mr. Putin. And so the resentment has continued to build that NATO is there. Armed forces have been moved into forward positions, say in the Baltics and Poland. He doesn't think the West is listening to him. He thinks he has a lot of clout because he provides a lot of energy to Europe.
Yeah.
He thinks the West is getting weaker. Britain leaving the EU fractured the EU. US in turmoil, Trump presidency, Biden weak. Biden withdrawal from Afghanistan, chaotic.
Yeah.
The West unable to cope in Iraq, had to pull out. Didn't do well in Syria, whereas Russia moved in and Russia did magnificently. Of course, Russia used air power in Syria, but the ground troops were all Syrian and Iranian, so they didn't take the risk that he's now taking in Ukraine.
Sure.
But I think all these things melded in his mind into a belief that actually Russia had a very powerful hard power stance and a much better equipped and exercised armed forces than it had had 15 years ago. And the West is looking increasingly risky, weak and disjointed, and it doesn't actually have the willpower to fight these wars anymore. So let's go for it. Angela Merkel has left Germany, so Germany is getting used to a new chancellor. Macron's distracted by his election. Boris Johnson just has woe after woe. Biden is weak. This is the moment. And oil prices and gas prices are high, so he's got the West in the throttle, certainly Europe, because they rely on his energy. Actually, it didn't turn out like that. I would have thought, if that was his calculation, that the way the West has A, united and B, been so tough on sanctions, even now talking about at speed trying to wean themselves off Russian oil and gas, this was not what he expected. Whether it will make him change his mind now, I don't know. We'll see. There have been talks on the border between the Russians and Ukrainians. Their foreign ministers are meeting. These things don't lead to some peace deal quickly. You always have a parallel diplomatic process and a military war still going on. But they're not refusing to talk to the Ukrainians, even though they started out by saying they were neo-Nazis and fascists. So I think that's one to watch. But I don't know how much he knows and accepts that the Russians have had problems in Ukraine. And he may think, well, okay, we had a few problems to begin with, but look at the territory we've taken already. We're doing quite well. And we have chosen to go slow on this. It's our timetable. And if we choose to ramp it up and be even tougher, we can just obliterate, certainly the east part of this country. Quite how he thinks they could hold and occupy it, I do not understand.
No.
But I think maybe you asked about me meeting him. He seemed very rational in the early years, and he seemed quite attuned and prepared to engage on his terms with Western partners to begin with. They kind of failed his test in his mind.
Sure.
And so he said, right, I gave you a chance, now you've turned me down, so you reap the consequences. And he seems to have got more prepared to be brutal as time goes on. I mean, right at the beginning, when he first came to power, they razed Grozny to the ground in Chechnya. Of course, the West didn't produce worldwide sanctions on him for that, so he probably thought they're prepared to weather it. If you think about the barrel bombing in Aleppo in Syria, it was just appalling.
Yes.
And there were protests at the UN, but again, we didn't really put Russia in the deep freeze for that. So again, he might have drawn his conclusions from that the West actually tolerates these things, because after all, they bomb people too. Look at Iraq and Afghanistan. Yeah. And I think he just maybe, over time, leaders who are in power a long time become more isolated. Mm-hmm. They have less and less access to people who challenge them. COVID won't have helped. He is clearly paranoid about COVID, from what we can glean. Mm-hmm. Those long tables when he meets his ministers or foreign dignitaries, even now. I mean, actually, Russia, I think, has been rather later than the UK suffering from Omicron, so they are worried about infection. But that must have isolated even more. And then, we were talking about how you evaluate the information war. What pieces of data is he being given to put together? Maybe in the armed forces, he's telling them, are so-and-so ready? Can they do this and that? And of course, they're going to say yes. Yeah. So that would be very Soviet. Back in the Soviet Union, they were always reporting up to the top that the grain harvest was better every year. At the same time, they were queuing in shops.
Sure.
So I think maybe he hasn't, he should have been clever enough to realize that he needed better information. But I think he wanted to believe something. And he may still believe that Russia, in brutal, hard power terms, has the will to inflict its might on Ukraine in a way that the West, he thinks there's NATO, refusing to get involved in this fight, just shows they're weak.
Yeah.
And he doesn't see there's a slightly more subtle game going on with the West. And I think he will also say, well, we should have more. In 2014, when they invaded Crimea and there were Western sanctions, he said, right, this is good for our policy of import substitution, as they called it, which was to get over the hump of Russia just relying on its raw material exports of oil and gas and timber and minerals, and instead trying to build up capacity at home to produce finished goods so that they could both supply the home market and rely less on imports, but also they could export more. So he will talk about that. And he will say, well, if Visa and MasterCard have cancelled on us or there's no more Pepsi-Cola, that's fine. We'll create our own, or we'll do a deal with China and we'll collaborate with China. We'll sell our oil to Iran. So actually what these non-Western countries do now is really important as this war continues. If they feel they have to choose between Russia and the West, which way will they go? Which means that, already it seems certainly the Turks, but also the Chinese are trying very hard to mediate because they all want this to stop. But whether they'll have the ability to influence the Kremlin in that way, I don't know.
There seem to be two fairly dominant narratives. They're possibly quite reductionist in terms of intent. One of them being, that Putin is ill, perhaps terminally ill, and looking to reinstitute former borders of what was the Soviet Union. Another one being that it's simply that he wants to create a buffer between Russia and NATO. Do you think there's more credence in one or the other of those arguments, or perhaps a combination of the both?
Well, I think it is a combination. Buffer between Russia and NATO, yes, definitely. I think he thinks that Russia's a big power, and these countries are all small countries, and so Russia has the right to a sphere of influence, just as he thinks the United States does. And they should be the countries around it. It's quite interesting if you look at his speeches or who he talks to. He often wants to talk to the United States as the other big superpower that between them they control 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. We live in a post-nuclear world too now, where warfare is often other means. But he still likes to focus on nuclear weapons because that's where Russia has a clear dominance over many other countries, but also size.
Yeah.
And of course, he's talking about geographical size, because if you talk about economic clout, Russia doesn't actually stack up quite so high as quite a lot of European countries. But, so you like to think, it is the largest country in the world, geographically. So because it's a former empire and it had these satellite states, he definitely is a man who is looking back at history. And part of its recent history, he has quite a complicated attitude towards the Soviet Union. He thought the communist regime was misguided and economically was not the right way to organize things. He doesn't want a communist regime back. Single party, maybe, controlled by him and the state, but not communist. That's to say, the economy controlled from the center. He also criticized the Bolsheviks because he thinks that they made Ukraine a separate country, and that's the start of the problem, because actually it should have been part of the Russian Empire. So he tends to look back at the Russian Tsars, Peter the Great, and especially Catherine the Great, she was the one who took Crimea from the Ottoman Empire, created a separate Khanate to begin with, and then incorporated it into the Russian Empire. So that's sort of one place that he goes back in history. Another place he goes back is 1,000 years ago to Kievan Rus, when allegedly the Russian state was formed from princes in Kiev, and the Russian Orthodox Church, they converted to Christianity, brought to them from Constantinople. And then eventually the princes moved north, and the new capital became in time Moscow. But he likes to look back to the birth of Russian Orthodoxy, Russian Christianity, as the beginning of the nation, and therefore Ukraine is where it began. So it's not just about buffer state. In the last 8-9 years or so, he started to bring history and religion into this. So that might be one reason that he feels, with an imperial state of mind, that Russia has the right to these things, and smaller countries who are recent countries have less of a right. So Ukraine doesn't have the same right to be sovereign and decide on its own future as Russia does, because it's basically smaller and it's a recent country, and he would say it's disputed whether it should be there anyway. And of course you could hold that for other countries potentially, Belarus being one. So NATO's position beyond the border has become a reason why Russia needs this buffer zone, because there is an enemy there. It wasn't originally, but now it is. And of course, the more Russia's been threatening, the more NATO has moved positions, weapons into positions to protect the Baltics. So then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's quite common with Mr. Putin. He quite often sees enemies and then rallies Russia against them, and then they react, and then he says, there you are, you see, the Chechens are terrorists.
Right, yeah.
They started out wanting self-determination, the Chechens, and they became terrorists. I'm not saying they weren't, but I am saying that it can sometimes create a self-fulfilling prophecy. There's another story with NATO, which is it looked for a purpose overseas in Afghanistan, which didn't work. So from NATO's point of view, having its old enemy suddenly revived gives it a new purpose too. Let's not forget that. But I think that in himself, he's look back to history is also part of his search for his own role in Russia's history. And he's been there nearly a quarter of a century, and I'm sure he is thinking, what is it I'm leaving now? I've achieved being president for this long and father of the nation. How will I be remembered by history books? And Crimea is one thing. And if he could bring back Ukraine too, then he would be remembered as the leader of Russia who recreated the Russian Empire as it should be. So that maybe it's a sort of messianic feel. Now, is that related to the feeling that he thinks he's not due to be on this earth much longer? That's total speculation about his health. He's become quite puffy. Some people think that could be steroids. So has he got some terminal illness? It's been like that for a while, since 2011, 2012. So, if there is some kind of medical reason, he's still playing ice hockey and, doing quite well, looking quite well physically. So I don't know, I think it's a bit of wishful thinking that there's some terminal disease there. The other thought was that it may just be that he thought in order to be credible and supported by the Russian people, he should try to look more youthful and healthy. So it's a dose of Botox to get rid of the wrinkles. He was very close to Berlusconi, the Italian prime minister, who was, he would have hair transplants and Botox and things. So I think it's entirely possible that Berlusconi said, I could introduce you to my plastic surgeon if you want, Vladimir. But he's gone on doing it. Berlusconi is no longer on the scene and he's still looking puffy. So I don't know. Maybe there is some medical thing there. Some people think that he's complained of back problems, that maybe he's having to take steroids for that, and that could have the impact of making him more puffy. So I don't know about his health. I think we have to reserve judgment, look at all the options, but not be seduced into seeing that one of those might be the reason. But I do think that he does think about his place in history. In 2007, when he was just about to step down from 2 terms as president, the law was you could only be two 4-year terms. And he wanted to obey the law in those days. And he was sort of lining up a successor rather at the last minute. And we said, so what are you going to do if you're no longer president? And he said to us, well, I think I'd like to stay father of the nation because I want to make sure whoever becomes the next president does the right thing. In other words, he's not really going to give up power. Sure. And that's what happened. He made himself prime minister and he still intervened a lot. And after 4 years, Medvedev, who he put in his place, he got rid of, well, he didn't get rid of him, but they did what the Russians call a castling, like in chess. Okay. Where you change the king with the rook.
Yeah.
So Medvedev went back to being prime minister and he became president again. And then, then he was there to stay.
Sure.
So it feels to me like he has tried once having a successor and he hasn't much liked it. So he's decided it's too risky to have another one because he thinks they make bad choices.
Right. Okay.
And I think also he now feels, to the point that he looks a bit isolated. I'm not sure he does much else except watch television, read whatever reports he gets, think about these things, play ice hockey, and, brood on his place in Russia. And there was an occasion, I think it was 2014 maybe, when I was at an event where we were going to meet him afterwards. And his deputy chief of staff, we were talking about this, about his place vis-a-vis Russia. And he said, memorable phrase, he said, без Putina нет России, без России нет Putina. Without Russia, there is no Putin. Without Putin, there is no Russia. So he was kind of saying, as it were, talking, as it were, for Putin, that Mr. Putin feels that if he's not president, then Russia would be in jeopardy.
Right.
But also what you can read into the other way around, he put that formulation, is that if Putin was no longer president, what identity would he have?
Yeah.
So I think that does sum him up quite well, really. And of course, then it means that so he's laid all his cards on the table with this invasion. It's kind of the final flush, his final move in the poker game. So that's a bit terrifying, really, because if that's the case, then if he's prepared to go all out for it, what on earth might he do? But hopefully around him, there'll be people with sense who will prevail and will be bringing him more realistic information about what is happening. And maybe, as he did in 2008 with Georgia, and as happened in 2014 with Ukraine, he didn't invade the whole country. So maybe he'll stop this time too.
So in terms of legacy, I mean, he's shown the past he's willing to use pretty horrific acts of warfare in terms of hyperbaric bombs. There's reports today of butterfly landmines that are dropped from planes and look fairly similar to toys, so to often end up being picked up by children, and they're designed to maim rather than kill. He's spoken of this sort of nuclear escalation. Do you think then that we should be worried about that? Or?
Okay, I think there are two different things here. Less than desirable ways of carrying out warfare in order to be more lethal is what happens in war. Mm-hmm. I mean, I remember cluster bombs being talked about over Kosovo. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's put that one to one side. And anyway, who knows if it's true or not?
Yeah.
But on the nuclear thing, he has threatened it. I mean, he did indicate in a rather bizarre encounter he had with some women air pilots just ahead of International Women's Day. It's a strange choice when Aeroflot's been pretty well grounded and can't fly anywhere except Belarus. But there you are. He wanted to be surrounded by women. And I think he said something about how he was provoked into putting Russia onto more alert because of something Liz Truss said. And then he said, of course, women politicians, sort of disparagingly. Anyway, but I think there's a certain amount of rhetoric being bandied around on the nuclear front, and he does it periodically. He will say, if you don't watch out, I'll put nuclear missiles in the Crimea. Or if you don't watch out, I will put on high alert nuclear missiles in Kaliningrad, which is surrounded by Europe. Poland, Germany, Lithuania. So this rhetoric has been there before. So, of course, we're paying more attention to it now because he's actually acted with his army. And I think you can't rule anything out, but I do think we should draw a little bit of comfort from the fact that just before this began, he had this security meeting of his top people, and they had an encounter which was televised when he basically made them each come forward and support Russia recognizing the independence of these little enclaves in the east, Donetsk and Luhansk, which we now know is a prelude to the invasion and a pretext for the invasion, because they were recognized as independents and now Russia was coming to their aid. This is the special operation.
Yeah.
But they all looked totally shocked, these men. And the foreign minister came forward and said, well, I'm still having negotiations and meetings, and I think I should have another one this week. And Putin sort of cut across him and said, no, but do you recognize, do you agree with what we're doing here? And it was clear that we were moving into a new phase of war, and the foreign minister hadn't quite got it yet.
Yeah.
And then there was the spy chief, Narishkin, who's an old friend of his, another long-time KGB operative, and he was stuttering and unclear what to do. And I mean, in retrospect, it just seems to me that Putin had come out and said, right, now we're going to do this thing, and you're all in on it, and this is what we have to do. Our patience has run out, and we're threatened by NATO, whatever he said to them. Now, come forward and, let's put this on the record. And they suddenly realized they're being made to go on camera in order to sign up to this collective liability. Yeah. They weren't ready for it.
No.
So if they're not ready for it, then what are they feeling now? We don't know, but I think it's worth asking the question.
For sure. I did see that interview with the spy chief, who looked utterly intimidated by Putin.
He did. I mean, subsequently he's done other pronouncements when he's been totally on message. And, same with the foreign minister. But, in a world, in that sort of world, you probably are very careful what you say in public. So we just have to wonder what's in their heads.
And I think there was some reporting today as well, not confirmed, but around messages being leaked from within the Kremlin around nuclear weapons and whether they might or might not be used. But again, I guess this comes back into the information warfare
I haven't seen that, but,
sector of working out whether that's even true.
I have seen a couple of reports from apparently high-level sources, one in the FSB, Intelligence Service, and one from elsewhere in the government, saying people didn't know this was going to happen and they were appalled. And now it's a huge mess. Is that true? It rings true to me, given what I know about the Soviet Union and the way it used to be, and given that little encounter we saw Putin stage, which was recorded and it wasn't live, and they still decided to put it out with this stuttering spy chief to humiliate him on camera. So I would think it's entirely credible. And there have been a lot of recent petitions from cultural figures in Russia, from a whole load of scientific professors, and from other groups. And they've come forward appealing for peace and asking both sides to stop. Of course, they're in Russia. They're not going to say, Mr. Putin, stop invading. But codedly, what they're saying is we oppose the war. And so I think you can be, I think we can be fairly sure that there's a lot of disquiet. And the reason, anyone who's got any inkling of what's going on the ground and the civilian casualties, the feeling the war's not going well, the impact of sanctions and Russia suddenly being cut off from the rest of the world, so the isolation and the economic hardship that will come with that. And where this will lead in Russia, because it can only lead to a more oppressive environment for people living there. So that's also not good. So there are a number of reasons why, quietly in their kitchens or in their heads, lots of Russian people will not be happy with what's happening.
You touched on Liz Truss a few moments ago, and I know recently she made some comments perhaps caught off guard in terms of being in support of young people from the UK joining the Ukrainian Foreign Legion. Other ministers then came out after to question the legality of that in terms of the way the law stands in the UK currently. But I do know from Lads Advice there are a lot of young men that are on the group who are feeling like they really want to do something to help, and they feel quite disempowered by the situation. What is the best thing to do if you want to help? Have you got any thoughts on what might be useful?
I have been thinking about that, and I can completely sympathise with that feeling. I want to do something, and especially if you're ex-serviceman, you think, well, I am trained for this. This is what I could do. Yeah. But I think you need to listen very closely to the defence minister when he advises against it. I mean, it has been said that as serving anyone actively in an active service have been told they're not to do this.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's very clear. But if you're an ex-serviceman, you might say, well, that's not me. But I think you have to think, number one, this has been said by people in the Ministry of Defence, so it's not the first time you'd hear this, but I totally agree with this, that if you were to go off and rock up and then be captured by the Russians, you are a perfect propaganda tool for them to say NATO's in the war. They won't care if you're ex-service or serving. No. For them, you're a British soldier.
Yeah.
So do you want to hand them that propaganda weapon, which is a very dangerous one? But I would also say, on a more practical level, just stop and think for a minute. Here is a country which is being pounded and is in disarray. Its own armed forces are actually doing relatively well under the circumstances. There is a volunteer force of an extraordinary number of a whole array of ages and sex, gender, Ukrainians who are picking up weapons and learning what to do. And they may not be trained like someone who's been through the British Armed Forces, but they may have more useful attributes than someone coming from here has. One of them is language.
Yeah, for sure.
And if you're suddenly on a battlefield and you come across, we've seen, I don't know, you've probably seen this on YouTube too, you come across a Russian tank by the side of the road. If you're another Ukrainian, you can cheerily say, oh, you're all right, run out of petrol. Shall I tow you back to Russia and have a joke? And then find out they don't know where the hell they are. And you're filming it. That's terribly powerful, right?
Yes, yeah.
If you're British, what can you do? You can't help in that situation. Yeah. And actually, encouraging Russian soldiers to stop fighting and to join the Ukrainians and to be allowed to ring home and tell their mum what's going on and maybe tell everyone what's going on is much more useful than engaging them in combat. Because we don't actually want to have poor dead Russian servicemen who never expected to be there in the first place. So that's one thing. The second thing is, in the areas of combat, they're now running out of food and water. It's just going to be hard to look after the people who are there without any foreigners rocking up who also need food and water in somewhere. Yeah. And I just think, if you think about it a bit harder, it seems selfless to offer to go and potentially give up your life for this other country. But actually, part of it is about making you feel you're doing something. And if you're going to be taking away food and water from vulnerable Ukrainian citizens, that's the opposite of selfless.
Right.
And so what else can you do? Well, there is a huge logistical exercise going on with refugees. What do we think's come out? 1.5 million. I think they're predicting 5 million. The greatest number of refugees in Europe since the Second World War. How else can people trained with all the logistical and useful skills that you get in the armed forces help, like being able to drive vehicles and organize and move things around? I don't know if there are refugee organizations you can volunteer for to help with the logistical operation throughout Europe, or just, there are now, we know there are people in Poland just going back and forth from the border, driving minibuses to collect refugees to take them to somewhere safe, further away from Ukraine. Now, you can't just rock up and say, okay, I'll drive a minibus on the border, because you become a problem if you're not part of some system.
Yeah.
But this is, even if there was a ceasefire tomorrow, there is a huge job to be done to look after these people and to rebuild. So I think it's a matter of thinking about it, researching, taking advice, talking to aid agencies. I had a look on the Ukrainian embassy's website in London. Mostly what they're asking for is donations in cash. Well, organising something in the UK which becomes whatever it is you're going to do, help repair a school, but get people to sponsor you. So you do some good here, but you collect the money, which you can then send. Maybe later you can go yourself to help in another way, which might be reconstruction more than warfare. But those are my thoughts on the matter. I think it's quite complicated to insert yourself. A, you could end up being a propaganda tool. Yeah. And B, you might be taking away resources from people who need it more.
I think that's really good advice, and that's a conversation we've had over and over again over the last sort of week or few days with young men about what is the purpose of this and what will it achieve, and do they marry up? And I think you've put that across really well. we're coming to the end of the time that you've been able to give to us. But I've found that really fascinating. I wonder if to finish, you could just tell us a little bit about your hopes for the future in terms of this situation and where you see it going, if the best possible scenario.
Well, obviously the best possible scenario is that it could end as soon as possible, because there are innocent people losing their lives and losing their homes. One wouldn't want that to be at a cost that Ukraine as a country is crippled. So I wouldn't say peace at any price. I don't think that's what the Ukrainians want. No. I also would say spare a thought for the Russians. Most Russians didn't know this was going to happen, didn't ask for it. And even if you see them on the television saying, I support the president, just think what you would do in those circumstances if someone shoved a microphone under your nose. And so this is a tragedy for two countries, not one.
Absolutely, yeah.
And finding a way out of it is going to, lots of things have been broken. Lots of trust has been broken. The longer the fighting lasts, the other casualty is not just people's lives and their livelihoods. It's also attitudes between people, and more anger there will be among the Ukrainians against all Russians, because they will have done all this damage to their country. And the more difficult it will be for Russians to build better relations, not just with the Ukrainians, but with Europeans, the Americans, other people in the West, because they'll say, look what they did. So we have a long road ahead of us. And I think maybe we all need to think back to things that now were before our lifetimes, which we'd sort of put in a history box and thought weren't really about us anymore. I mean, we thought the Cold War was over, now we're in a hot war. Yeah. But actually, when we come to the end of this, it's going to be like the end of the Second World War, when all sorts of unexpected things can happen. And what you need above all is to try and retain your humanity and understanding for other people, not to create new animosities and angers, which will create new fault lines that will take years and decades to sort out. So those are my thoughts.
Bridget Kendall, it's been really useful and fascinating to speak to you, and thanks ever so much for giving up the time to come on the podcast.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Got Your Six, Lads Advice Encounters with me, Gav Topley and Friends. As always, if you'd like to contact us, you can do so by emailing ladsadvice@hotmail.com, by commenting on the group on Facebook, Lads Advice, by checking out our Insta, lads_advice, or our Twitter, advice_lads. You can support our fundraising for Papyrus Prevention of Young Suicide, for which we have a £20,000 target, by sponsoring us at www.justgiving.com/fundraising/Chaz and Gav/Killy. Finally, if you'd like to support the podcast and the Facebook group, you can do so on patreon.com/Gav Topley. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.